you, panelists. I have talked to you on the phone and over email, so it's nice to put faces to names. The title of this panel conversation is Empowering Local Communities and Local Control, the Reality. And I think Dr. O'Day and the LCFF studies that she was reviewing sort of get to this reality, and we are fortunate enough to have folks that have been involved in reading lots of LCAPs on the ground who can vouch for whether or not how beastly they are to read, and to talk about how it actually has served to empower local communities through this idea of local control, their experiences, some of the lessons learned, and what their priorities are in moving forward. So I'm going to ask everybody just to give a little short opening statement. If you could introduce yourself, your organization, the work that you've been doing around local control and the LCAP work, as well as a lesson learned over the last couple of years, and we will start off that way. I'm gonna have you start.
You can or you can take this. Options. So many choices. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sara Mooney. I'm with the United Way of Greater Los Angeles. I lead a lot of the policy and advocacy work via our education team over there. Over the last 3 years, it's actually when I started with United Way, so I kind of got thrown into learning with the community about LCFF. What are base, supplemental, concentration, all of that. And our strategy the first year really started with, there's more money on the table, it's generated by high needs students, let's involve those high needs communities and ask what they want to see at their school sites. It seemed like a very simple kind of campaign for us to run through, right? So we did input sessions, we talked about base, supplemental, concentration, all of that, the opportunities that were there, and we created a list of demands for what we wanted to see. And that went relatively well, all things considered, but as we began to dig deeper into the budget, we figured it's not just talking about a program or a line item that you want to see in your budget. This really is, and I appreciate what Dr. O'Day was saying, this really is about a whole systems change. This really is about what's going on at the base level with your schools. How is money from the base even being allocated to your schools? And how is it really being used to address systemic historical inequities in our communities? So we went from year one just saying what we wanted out of the budget, and now we are really doing deep dives into those budgets at the base level, looking at allocations, and really trying to think, how do we demand and work with LUSD around that broader strategy for improvement? How do we really begin to undo years and years and years of underfunding and lack of funding in our highest needs communities? So that is it's been quite the learning process for all of us. We are, I get to work with Sandy, which is a great privilege, around this issue. So it's kind of gone from a very simple understanding of wanting more programs to this much bigger push to change an incredibly large system. So that's kind of where we are today. Yeah, thank you.
Can you, I don't know if this is on.
We'll move it on.
So good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. So I appreciate the opportunity to come from LA and share some time with you. I was afraid we weren't going to make it because of the weather. I'm with Families in Schools, as you know, and we work a lot with parents and school staff and parent leaders and district leaders. And it's been a fascinating journey in this LCFF process for the last 4 years, technically, because from day one, working with many people in this room and outside of this room. Last year, there was, I believe, a statewide survey of parents that was looking at what they thought about LCFF and also about their engagement. And I believe that for the most part, and this is confirming what we already knew, that they care about their engagement with their children's education. a lot of people say they don't care. District people, school staff might say that or think that in some cases, but we know that's not true. And oftentimes, it's just what stands up for them is the barriers that exist. Sometimes they're imaginary, sometimes they're invisible, but they somehow exist, where they're not welcoming environments for many of these parents who want to work closely with their district in terms of improving the school conditions, but also more often because their child, they want to support their child's education at home and at school. And in talking with over a dozen school districts across the state, we've also learned, and it wasn't surprising to us, that they also are feeling overwhelmed by this work with LCFF in terms of making parent engagement a priority and having their input on the LCAP, because if they weren't doing parent engagement right and well in the beginning, they certainly didn't learn it overnight to get to do the LCAP in the last 2-3 years, okay? So it's been a struggle for them to do this successfully. And I think that what we have to realize that everybody's learning as we're building this ship. It's very, very messy. And it's like waiting for the ship to come down as opposed to trying to seize this moment as an opportunity, and parents feel in the first year that this was a moment that they were having because their voices were being heard for the first time in many cases. They felt like, wow, we're not alone in this. We're talking about English learners, we're talking about translation needs, we're talking about interpretation, we're talking about using resources in a much more strategic manner, and they finally feel like their voices are getting captured. And we found evidence of that districts were putting some of that into play. But there's still some issues of trust, there's still some issues of still old habits die hard kind of thing, where the compliance is still alive and well. And I think that if the LCAP may have a shelf life of 10 years, I think that districts are just going to wait it out so that it could disappear, and they could continue doing what they've been doing all along. And we can't let that happen. And parents don't want to let that happen too, because they know that this time may not come around again for another 30, 40, 50 years. And we don't have time for that. So, and I could see some heads shaking, and Nancy, you can't, we're gonna have to bring you back. But there's been some good work here, and we want to recognize that everybody has been trying to work closely together in spite of the tensions. And yes, we've had tensions. Even in the advocacy groups, we've had tensions. I think that's healthy. I think that's normal. But how we get out of that process is going to be a testament to how we think about ourselves and the kids, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. And if we put our egos aside and really look at what's more important is the kids, then we should be looking at the LCAT not as a document, as a paper document. In some cases, it's a paperweight, but as a way to open up these conversations and have honest, robust dialogue so that we could get to the lessons and implement with fidelity what needs to happen at the local level.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Geordee Corpuz, and I'm an organizer with Californians for Justice, and I'm representing an organization that organizes young people, because we believe that young people of color are the leaders we need to have the schools and communities we need. And so what we do across the state is that we train young leaders to run campaigns that focuses on improving their school conditions so that they can thrive. And so I just want to say this because I represent 4 regions in the state. So I'm representing Oakland, San Jose, Fresno, and Long Beach. And so LCFF and the LCAP, I think like a lot of the panelists here, has meant a lot to us. Where we are in this moment as a youth organization is, we were there like a lot of the faces in this room, fighting to pass LCFF because our young people believed it's what needed to happen in the funding system. We also, right after LCFF was won, with a lot of people in Alliance in this room, fought to have student voice in the regulations in LCFF. And just now this year, which I think is really amazing, because we're about to have an accountability system that has indicators on school climate. So our students actually fought to have that there, and stressing the importance that relationship-centered school climate is just as important as academics, right? And so I think our work has been centering the voices of students, and then also in partnership with families, students and families, in the decisions being made in LCFF and the LCAP. And what that's looked like, and I think it points to a lot of the tensions and just a lot of like the new of what needs to happen and change in our culture of budgeting is we're organizing students, on the ground to just be leaders in the community and have a voice in the budget, but also working collaboratively with district and district leaders, right? Working with them so that they can center the decisions that are being made in the LCFF and in LCAP on those students and families. And that's looked like so many things. For us, it's looked like helping the districts build in processes. Like in Oakland, we have a student advisory committee. We've done participatory budgeting in San Jose, even to just having broad engagement of students and families in the districts. It's looked like working with them one-on-one, being partners with them, being thought partners with them on what real engagement looks like, but also what does achievement look like for our students and families, because it's not just only about the process, it's that actually the students and families believe in this process and feel it's going to get them somewhere. And then it's also taken us to kind of, I guess we're thought partners, and we want to be partners with the district because we're challenging a culture of what budgeting used to be, and kind of what we envision, what LCAP and LCFF can bring to our schools, which is like real partnerships with our districts so that we can get the schools that we envision. And so yeah, that's what our work has been like for the past 3 years.
Hello, I'm Kitty Catania. I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Fresno County Office of Education, and I also this year am the Chair of the Curriculum and Instruction Steering Committee of the County Superintendents Association. So I took note of the description up there, County Office of Education as a mediator role. And I think sometimes, especially in the last year or two, working in partnership with the advocacy groups, that's been a really important and a very complex role that county offices have played. Because just looking at the overall purpose of the LCAP to really tell the story of the programs of support and the importance of closing the achievement gap and equity for those student populations, and really identifying all the subgroups that are within a district and making sure that they're represented and programs are addressing those students, and that ongoing monitor of their progress is part of the LCAP. And then, at the same time, looking at the readability of LCAP when we know most of the LCAPs are well over 100 pages, some approaching 300 to 500 pages. So, and that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because who can read a 500-page document and figure it out? So part of the county office role is really something that we really struggle with and try and help solve is in the LCAPs, what's the level of description for the various programs to speak to equity and to speak to all the represented student groups, versus now those plans go on to 1,200 pages, 1,400 pages. So the notion about understanding the local context is really important. And I think the county offices are in a lot of times in the whole overall system, county offices are in a unique position to understand the local context of that district. And so we really try and work with the districts to put enough detail in there that all the various stakeholders and groups can understand why funding is being spent on a certain thing, and to feel assured that all the students are being addressed, and those the students of color and the students with graduation rates and suspension and expulsion rates and chronic absenteeism are really being addressed, and their parents are being brought forward with their voice, but yet not so overwhelming that nobody is even going to, you know, pick the LCUP off the shelf. So I think a trend that has been growing is the idea of the infographic summary. So we're hoping that that continues to grow, because I think that that's a document that really helps locally and throughout a region or the state to try and get some sense in a few pages of what a particular district is really focusing on and attempting to do. The other thing that we struggle with as county offices when we're the authorizer of approving the LCAPs along with their budgets is the notion of what type of funding has to be in the LCAP. And, you know, to speak very frankly, we have districts that look at the statutes in the Ed Code and says, we'll meet the statutes in the Ed Code, but don't ask us to do more beyond that. And not because they don't necessarily want to. Once again, it's just the complexity of these documents going to thousands of pages. LAUSD, good heavens, you know. So where's the middle ground for that? So I really appreciate the policy people and the advocacy groups working through that along with the county offices to find out where can we be able to tell more of the whole story of where the district is spending money and what resources and programs they're supporting, and including all the funding in that story, but yet making sure that the county offices that are making sure that their LCAPs are meeting the requirements, make sure that we have the statutes in the Ed Code that we can point to say, yes, it is required that these elements be in there. Not because, and it's that fine line between compliance and really telling your story and people being being able to understand your story. So that's really critical. And then there was a question before about the state county accountability and who's being held accountable to make sure that these resources and programs are working. And I would just give a shout out to exclamation point on evidence-based programs, because that's so important. You know, we have in Fresno County, we have school districts from 59 kids up in the mountains to little bitty rural farm towns that have schools that have like 86 students, to Fresno Unified that has, over almost 70,000 students. So that whole idea about when some of these districts struggle with their systems, and sometimes I'm sure everybody in the state has little pockets of when governance kind of goes awry and there's some political things going on in a community. We recently have an ongoing one to the paper in Fresno County, but as a county office, as you know, there's only one condition that the county superintendent can take authority over a school and appoint a person that can help get the district systems back in place and make sure that that all of the functions of the school district are operating in the best interests of students. And the only one, right now, the only one aspect that they're able to do that is if the district becomes insolvent, if it's fiscal. If a district is completely, absolutely, academically bankrupt, the county superintendent can't do anything, nor actually can the state superintendent at this point in time. So since it's pretty much all policy people in the room, I think I would just take the opportune moment just to remind you about that, the AB 1200 that gives us, the county offices, superintendent, the authority to intervene in a district for the good of students. There's no such thing for intervening because of governance failure or academic failure. if you think that's not important, we have an ongoing district. They've canceled, they meet once a month for board meetings. They've canceled 3 board meetings because board members just pretty much chose not to come. And so students didn't have summer programs. Students didn't have books when school started up because there was nobody to approve those items. So I would just, in the LCAP process, as we're looking at the district and the story and to the issue about accountability, you know, unfortunately, when those things kind of fail, there's currently not a mechanism where the local county superintendent that would most know that district's needs and issues can step in and help that district, anything other than financially. So I would just add that.
Good morning. Oh, that was weak. Good morning. Good morning. How you doing? That'll wake us up in here. Good morning. My name is Nicole Anderson, and I want to start by introducing myself as a mother. I'm a mother of 3 African-American children who are in the public school system. The baby is a 3-year-old who is in preschool but will soon be in the system. So I include him because he's also going to become a product. And so I'm also introducing myself as a former elementary principal who worked in a very diverse place where kids of color, I keep hearing that word, I hear the word equity, I hear all of the different things that you kind of hear within this LCAP, LCFF conversation. But most recently, I am representing the Association of California School Administrators, known as ACSA. And I am currently the Diversity and Equal Access Executive, which is kind of, lack of a better word, the equity administrator that you see popping up around districts all of a sudden because of LCAP. And LCFF, I should say. And so when I think about lessons learned from this process, I think about some of the work that we've been doing in AXA in particular to help build capacity of our leaders. Because I think we all know in the room that our educational system is very, very heavily impacted by our leaders. And if we don't have effective leaders, then our school systems really are not going to move very far when we talk about being even compliant with policy and what that means. And so I think to give you context in terms of lessons learned, for us in AXA, what we focused on is really trying to provide some professional development that helps our leaders to grow. In terms of understanding, one, the system of education was never designed to serve all. And so when trying to implement another policy, which we know that federal and state policy has come and gone every so often, I don't know the exact trend in terms of years, but we know that historically legislation comes and goes, and as educators, we tend to focus our work on that. And sometimes we don't work on mindset and belief systems, which is what LCFF is calling us to do. We keep using the word equity, but we really don't know what it means. And because we've had historically in America, we've had a very tough time with addressing not equity, we've had a tough time addressing equality. And we have never gotten to that place, which is why this is so hard and why it's so complex and why we have such division actually happening at times with communities where we have very affluent communities that are having a hard time understanding why are you now shifting resources to those kids, right? I know we've heard those things. So going to that piece, what we try to do is really help our leaders in particular, our principals, our superintendents, those who are in the trenches, we call boots on the ground. Those are the ones that are responsible for changing the landscape. Legislation is up here. And so that policy is awesome. There's great enthusiasm, I agree. And I think we all can agree that this is an awesome time in education. We've never really been here before. But I think the piece that we have to understand is that if we don't have a mindset change in education, LCFF will come and go, and our education gaps will continue to grow. We will continue to miss opportunities to close those gaps, considering we now have multiple measures. It's not just about test scores. And I heard us talk about school climate and what that looks like for kids going to school each day. Understanding that adults who are also products of this system, if I asked you to all raise your hand, most of us went through public school, I would assume, right? So therefore, I'm going to now point to myself as a former principal and teacher. I also went through public school, so I perpetuate a lot of things that I learned by going through that system. So who was I to change the system? Who was I to change my mindset? So the blessing of LCFF is that it gives us kind of the prompt now to change our mindsets about how we do business with regards to allocating resources to kids that we are now calling out. We are now calling out foster youth, kids who are in poverty, and obviously kids who who are English learners. But what we also have to do is help our leaders understand that we can't stop there, because in order to close gaps, you have to look at all kids. And so when we start calling out kids of color and actually saying that word, African American boys, right? We have to start looking at that. And there are a few districts who have strategically focused on the kids at the local level because that's relevant to them. But we also have to look at our Native American kids, where we have been culturally destructive in America. And those kids, we use the word again, those, right? Those kids are our kids who also need to be called out in this process in order to really close the gaps that exist. And so I think, again, the lessons learned is that we have a lot more to learn, but this has given us an awesome opportunity to now focus on building the capacity of our leaders in particular, who can now actually lead the process in actually closing educational gaps for our kids who have historically not been served well by the system, not underperformed, but have not been served well by the system, which has resulted in them and their achievement levels not being where we say we want them to be. And so it's really about mindset change at this point in time. And so I'll stop there with regards to the lessons learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm reminded from all of your remarks, as well as Dr. O'Day's talking about how piecemeal reforms, it's not going to cut it, and that this is really about confronting organizational dysfunction or these cultures that have taken years and years and years to build. At the same time, there's a reality facing us. We like to say that we're sort of still in early implementation of LCFF, but we know that there is a timeline here. We know that there is a timeline. Sandy, you sort of referred to it, whatever the shelf life of this legislation is. So with that in mind, what are the priorities and how do you define success if we have sort of a countdown clock going? To we make the case to say that this has been a success, not just an opportunity and a great time to be working on these things? A few of you want to respond to that.
Well, I'll start. I think that for us at the county office level, we would say that the current environment we're in, I agree, it's a great opportunity, because if we all work together and really make sure that those districts, LCAP, has the right metrics and the right goal set, and then we ongoing help the districts monitor and report out and involve the stakeholders and make sure that there's enough of those goals are set with significant enough results on a year-to-year basis, that our success would be that all kids graduate with the opportunities and college and career readiness that we know they're all capable of. That's a big lift, but it's done month by month and semester by semester. It'll get there over 3 years, 4 years, 7 years, but the month by month and semester by the semester monitoring and setting the right goals and metrics that we can help them monitor, to me, that's the foundational piece. So that would be at least the starting point for us in success and the end goal.
So engaging parents is a process and a goal. So we kind of see that as in alignment. When we were talking to school districts, again, they were saying that they were doing what they could, but they could do better. An assistant superintendent said, we give ourselves an F. I think it's pretty enlightening when they're not hiding behind, they're being honest. And the thing is that this is an opportunity for really changing the game. of how we are working with the unusual suspects, because I think as someone said in the said earlier about, we have to collaborate, and that's true. We have to work differently, and we have to align our resources a lot smarter. And these terms and these things are not new concepts. We've been doing this, but I don't think we've been doing this more intentionally. And with the stakes so high, we have to really think about this in an urgent way. We don't have like next year and 10 years from now. We have right now this moment, and parents are watching. They're watching to see if everything that's been told to them is going to be true. Their input, how is that being taken seriously in the LCAP? Is it the evidence is there, and they can tell if they're making a difference, and in some cases they are. And we got to raise those best practices and those things that are changing the landscape to the forefront, so that we're not talking about the problems, we're talking about what is actually working. Because in some districts, what parents say, we need translators, they hire them. In one district who has nothing but Spanish language parents, they were always talking about not being included in these meetings. And all of a sudden, this district with LCFF money, they bought their equipment for the very first time over decades of not having done that. So is this equity, or is this just finally listening and paying attention and making sense of what parents want? So these are just very basic things, but districts are hard-pressed about doing it right, and they're being honest about that, and they need the help and support. And so they are having to go outside of themselves and work with nonprofits, work with CBOs, work with the community in different ways than they've ever had to before. And they have to think about this in partnership. So this is, again, not typical behavior. This is going to have to become the typical behavior if we're going to expect this to last longer than 10 years and see some evidence of parents becoming the norm in terms of taking them coming in and then finding themselves in a place where there's workshops already established that speak to them. There's principals and staff that can speak to them in their language, and they do outreach in such a way that it's not bringing in the same parents, but going out and getting the new and hard to reach parents because they're there, but they just don't know how to connect. So it's about communication, improving communication. It's about broadening your base. It's about stronger collaboration. It's about trust and relationship building. And these are, again, not new concepts. We just got to figure out how to do this in a more normal, active way.
I'll chime in just two things. I think of that question in regards to what success looks like as there's kind of this long-term success, which is more systematic, because this is going to take quite some time to undo hundreds of years worth of dysfunction, I think is the word. But then there's the short-term success. For long-term, I think it's just simply success is that we close gaps, right? We have all these gaps. We have acknowledgement gaps and service gaps, and we hear achievement gap the most often, but again, that's about academics. But we have so many other gaps that we don't really measure, and so I think this will create some measurements, and over time, if those gaps are closed, that's long-term success. But I think the short-term piece is really around, again, the resources. And so, again, with mindset changes, then people will understand what the needs are in order to allocate appropriate resources. I think we still are in traditional thinking, but I think success will help us to see non-traditional, services, products, the things that are needed in our system that we don't see. And so, for example, when we talk about professional development, we know that the school calendar does not provide adequate time for our educators, especially our teachers. So I'm going to go to the teacher piece because those are the ones who spend the most time with our kids. Their schedules do not permit for them to plan well. So I don't know why we expect to see things different in the classroom. With our new Common Core standards, right? And I'm being sarcastic because our teachers are really struggling right now. Even our phenomenal teachers are in a transition and we're putting a lot on their backs and asking them to differentiate for 30 different kids, if not more, based on now our new mindset about being equitable and really differentiating and actually providing resources at the ground level. But with professional development, if we don't give them time, so that's non-traditional. Let's change the calendar, right? That may be something that has to come in terms of legislation. It may need to be changed. We have to rethink school. And so maybe LCFF will provide that type of non-traditional way of thinking about school and giving us adequate time as educators to grow so that we can implement and do things differently than what we've done in the past. And so, when I think about a particular resource that I've seen in some school districts, but when you think about the whole child and thinking about kids who are in poverty, which we call out in LCFF, do we have full service community models in all of our districts? And why not? It's just amazing, but that's a mindset issue, right? Why don't our kids all have access to dental care? And why do we have to have them come to school and be in pain or they can't see? Things like those are just basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, let's just start with focusing on that. But again, that requires non-traditional things to be done in schools based on the resources we actually now have access to. But mindset change has to be that first piece in order to provide that opportunity. So that's all. Thank you.
I guess from the perspective of, especially from students of color, and I'm just going to say it's what success looks like, and I think for a lot of us here is that we have the schools that we want and we need, right? That we have the schools that, that look at the whole child, right? That look at social emotional, like their social emotional needs and their academic needs at the same time. But I think in the 8 years we have this process, right? When we get to the 8th year, I think what success can look like definitely to reach that vision is that we have a system all over the state in every district that's sustainable, that we've built all our people on the ground, all our stakeholders as leaders in this, and that they own this process, right? That we can have, we can hear the voices of students, families, educators, district admin, feel like, we feel good about this process. We feel like students and families, we've created partnerships that are lasting, right? Because it's not like this was a formula to just come here and then, it's gonna fix everything and go. It's really to shift our way to make something even more sustainable for our education system, even more transformative, right? And I think we can get there, and I think it also takes what success could look like. And what I think it will look like is the huge culture shift that a lot of us are talking about. It's like centering around shared decision making, which was built in this plan. This like spirit of continuous improvement, which I think is what I've seen at the district level can look so like different when you include students and family in that. It's like it makes the process so more well-rounded, right? And then I think cornering on sustainability. What is a process we're making? What is a process that can live even after this, or sustain more on that can help us reach to our vision of the schools that we want and need?
I definitely want to echo what most folks have said. For how we're moving through the coalition that United Way leads in LA is a kind of a multi-pronged approach that definitely involves that culture shift, definitely involves if you have a community whose capacity you can build to engage in these conversations ongoing, that's pretty successful, because if LCFF expires, you still have those parents, you still have those students who have that knowledge now to say, okay, well, what's your new system and how can we work with you on this? Mm-hmm. So that's one point, right? Also, we really believe in LUSD because it's so diverse. You have to really change how you distribute dollars to schools. You really have to be much more thoughtful about that. So in 2014, there was a big push to get this equity formula, this kind of revised formula that took into account not only your basic LCFF subcategories, but also exposure to violence, health issues, even outcomes at a school site, or even in a feeder pattern of schools. And then distribute dollars based on that formula. And how do you distribute dollars? This needs a culture shift in order to happen, but distribute dollars not just with your supplemental and concentration, but your whole budgets, right? That's really where the change lies. And then in addition to your distribution of dollars being really influenced and rooted in a multifaceted approach to equity, but also how do you connect those dollars to outcomes for students? We can't just, an example is the town hall that is mentioned in the pre-reading. We brought together over 100 students, and it really came to the surface that they needed more counselors. That's what they wanted to see, high school students. So LUSD was a fabulous partner and said, okay, we're going to allocate $13 million for counselor supports across the district. Come to find out a year later that even though that was a big win for us, and that, you know, we at that time defined that as success, many of the high schools did not even allocate those dollars or spend those dollars down. So I think to what Nicole is talking about around capacity and connecting your dollars and your allocations at your school sites to your outcomes is a third really important point that, you know, that's what success is. So that capacity building of your communities to consistently monitor and work with your district, and your district saying, okay, well, let's be thoughtful about what we're spending, who we're spending money on, how we're spending that money, and how we can really trace, you know, this influx of dollars to success for our highest need students.
I have at least 4 more questions, but I also promised that we would have some questions from you all in the audience. So if any of you have any questions, if you could just stand up and either direct to the full panel or to individual panelists. Jacqueline?
So I'm Jacqueline, I work with the Education Trust West. Several of you have mentioned this word trust, and Jennifer mentioned it as well. I think it's really important because I can picture how the status quo could continue, how for a parent arrives at these meetings and you feel like, who's really going to be there for my kid, right? If you have been underserved by the system in the past. And I also understand how for a district official, changing mindsets is really hard, and it's a really complicated reflection process, and it can feel like there's a lot of, like, being put on you a lot at stake, which can be really intimidating. So I'm wondering if you have any of you or all of you have specific examples of events you've been to or things you've heard people say or do that have helped to bring people back together and build that trust. Like, how do you do that?
Go ahead. Go.
Oh, I could definitely speak to I think what I've learned from Oakland Unified, it really takes the person who's going to be the liaison, really, like who, and it could be many people. It's those people in between that connect the budget system to like stakeholders, to parents and families. So for us in Oakland Unified, it's our LCAP manager, who also used to work in schools and worked in family engagement, right? And it's just like, and her name is Cynthia Molina, and she's amazing. And it's because of her, and not only her trust, like not only in just like in her trust in like what students and families have fought so hard for, to have this system that's inclusive, but also understanding kind of like the needs and the wants of students and families. When we're in the space, in the LCAP space, it does make it more trusting for students and families, because she's coming at it with the experience and the perspective of like, I understand because I was on the ground once and I know how it is, right? And I'm not gonna speak up here to the students and families. I'm gonna speak directly to their experience and what they're feeling, but also do my best to build the capacity to meet the language, sometimes the language barriers or the document barriers or the data barriers, right? And I think just even acknowledging that, or just even the tribe, that builds the trust, right? Because it's like, how many times have we walked into a meeting and it's like we're there and we just like, oh, we feel like disengaged already, because it's like we don't, it's just like there's not a meeting of halfway. So I think that's also in the trust. And I think what it also is our school leaders, right, who are also communicating this process on the ground. I think from what I've heard for a lot of families, especially at the school sites, it's like when our students, especially when they hear about LCFF or LCAP, because we know that communication about what LCFF and LCAP has been like kind of not as vocal as it should be. Like, it's not like, oh, it's like in the home or like, in every ears of every student. When my students hear that, they're like juiced because they're like, oh my gosh, like finally, like we're hearing this on the ground because everyone wants us to know. Our like school leaders want us to know what this you know, budget plan and this new budget formula is, right? And I think that in itself, like that really builds the trust. It's like almost validating, right? When you communicate that, or you even try to meet folks halfway.
Yeah, she stole my answer, so I won't I'll make up a new one. But actually, great question about trust, because I think that's probably the biggest barrier to a lot of this work is there's people involved, right? And people have been hurt. And so I think the liaison piece is absolutely essential, especially with parents. Again, I'm an African-American mom in a district where there's not many who look like me. And so sometimes I represent that liaison because I'm an educator, right? And I actually know how to navigate through, and I know the different leaders. However, parent liaisons are huge in districts when you're trying to bridge that gap, because there's sometimes it's not trust with a system who has hurt us. It has hurt us. But an actual practical example I actually saw recently and got a chance to participate in is all the way up in Del Norte County. For those of you that like to visit Northern California, beautiful place. However, some history there that's been very hurtful to the community with regards to the Native American community. And in particular, you know, historically it is the land where there's, I think it was the second largest massacre of our Native American people. And so there's a lot of hurt there. And so the new superintendent, this is his second year, I believe, up there, Jeff Harris. And he actually wanted to use this kind of LCFF opportunity to not just be in compliance, but to do the right thing finally. And so they actually had an event where it was a professional development day for everyone. And I was very non-traditional, again, where it wasn't about math and science and all the great stuff we do as educators. When we come back as teachers, we come back, you know, and we have this opportunity to talk about the curriculum. It was actually collaborative with the community. So you had different tribal councils there, you had students there, you had student advocacy groups there, and what you had is panels who talked about LGBT issues. You had panels that talked about, again, a lot about the Native American community, which had been harmed. It did not trust the school system. And then you had, so like I provided kind of this context of culturally proficient educators in particular. So you had all these different levels of professional development, but it was not just your teachers who came. It wasn't just your principals who came. There were parents there. There were community members, and it was what I saw as a real first step to close that gap around trust. And so when people left out, and this is all day, there was no keynotes and none of that, right? It was all collaborative. And so what a practical example that districts could actually do. And it's very genuine. And so you talk about breaking down some barriers and trust being rebuilt because you are now including people at the table, and it's genuine, and you get to hear stories, which is typically what we don't get to do in our school system. We don't take the time to share stories and really know who people are, which is what breaks down the barriers that cause us not to talk about the hard topics like race and what that looks like in our nation and where it has brought us from hundreds and hundreds of years ago to 1700s, where there was a system that was proposed from Thomas Jefferson around being two-track system. And that system still exists today. And that was totally about race at the time, but it was an advancement. And so now we're here having the same conversations in 2016. That's why people don't trust the system. But that Del Norte, look it up. I think it's hashtag Del Norte now, I think. But awesome experience. They got a lot of work to do, but they had started that process. And what a great example of trust that they are trying to build in this process. So.
Yeah, on the same issue, we had a parent stand up and say at a board meeting, "Do with us, not to us." And so what they're basically saying is that we want to partner with you, but you're not welcoming us in the way that you should. So I think if that is a place to start, at least be a welcoming environment, and that's a very basic place to start with when you're trying to build trust. And the other is when board members and district officials and school level people, they're not always in alignment with what that looks like. We had a board member say that, well, school principals have the budgets to invest in parent engagement, and they can spend the money any way they like. And then we had, in the same school, we talked to a parent and say, well, the school principal said we couldn't do that because there is no money. And then you had the district official in between saying, well, you know, those principals don't exist. They're no longer in the district. They used to have that attitude, but they're not there. It's the same district and 3 different perspectives, totally different. So when you have that kind of misalignment, there's a lot of room for improvement, obviously, but that's what the parent is seeing. 3 different voices, 3 different stories. And so how do you build trust when that's facing them? So I think that if you have parent facilitators at an LCAP session, that starts to build trust because the power got transferred to a parent, and the parent is helping to lead that conversation and talking parent to parent. That's building trust and relations. So that's another good place to start.
One of the aspects for the County Office of Education that many of the county offices have and the other county offices are adding as we're going into this environment, as you said, is building trust with those parents in the communities is a very complex process that starts and has to be facilitated for the best results. So at County Offices of Education, I'll talk about one specifically, has a Parent Services Center. And that Parent Services Center is available and goes out and works with the districts to talk to the district leadership and superintendents about what are you doing with your parent engagement, with your student engagement, and then they offer their services to begin to attend the existing parent meetings, be they the site councils, the DLACs, the ELACs, and the LCAP stakeholders meeting, and serve as a service to those districts, especially the small ones that might not be able to afford to have their own parent liaison, but that can, the county office can provide that support to take the time to really explain to the parents the LCAP process, the LCFF funding, so that when they go then to the larger district meetings, the LCAP stakeholder meetings, et cetera, they have a basic foundation of what the meeting is about, how they can add their voice to it, how they can look and make sure that their students are being representative. Because I always think about you talking about you're a mom and 3 kids, I'm a mom with 3 kids. Every parent is most concerned about their students. And then, of course, they're concerned about the students as a whole. But especially if you have a student that's in a subgroup that doesn't even come up on the new LCFF rubric or whatever, but you still want to know how your student doing and how your student group is doing. So I think part of what we're starting to see is successful with the parents is the county office role of providing those parent service centers to help with the process until the district can get underway enough to have their own process sustained and continuing.
Very quickly, we've hosted over the last 3 years probably about, I want to say, supporting our partners, almost 4,000 parents to come out to these sessions and students to give input, take the district survey. But this year we've really seen a demand for that really scale back. And what we believe is, what we've heard from our partners is parents come and they show up and they prepare and they have organizers who support them and they come with demands and the district says, okay, thanks, we'll see you next year. And there has to be a feedback loop. Parents have to see how their contributions are landing in the LCAP. Even, can you just highlight on the LCAP where you've moved money around per our recommendations? So parents and students really want to see that their voices are being heard and being integrated into the process. And then you have to, it's an iterative process, right? You have to go back, share out how you've made those changes and say, here's a new issue, or what else are you all wanting to focus on this year that we can build on? That has not happened in a very graceful or meaningful way quite yet, but I think that's what I've heard has been the key to really building that trust.
Any other questions? We could take like 1-2 minute question. No? Great. I want to thank this panel not only for sharing with us their work with regards to LCFF, but for the work that you're doing, and that you are really capitalizing on the continued enthusiasm. This is a half glass full panel, which I certainly appreciate, especially in thinking through what do we need to be investing in and moving forward with the policy and culture changes that are not going to be immediate, but I'm really glad that we have you all to be helping to lead this work across the state. So give this panel a hand.